You have seen these monsters before, not in real life, on a screen. The Witcher gave them yellow eyes, clawed hands, glowing forests, and a game engine. But the Witcher did not invent a single one of them. Real villagers described these exact creatures centuries before Geralt of Rivia existed. They wrote them into prayers, they nailed charms over doorways because of them. They built harvest schedules, burial customs, even marriage traditions around not angering them. Case file Slavic monsters behind the Witcher. 9 creatures. 9 case files. 9 fears that outlived the people who first felt them. One of these cases is the one I could not stop thinking about. I won't tell you which one. You'll know it the second you reach it. This isn't a monster list. Lists don't survive 1,000 years of retelling. What survives that long is something people were genuinely afraid of, every day. We're not staying in one place either. We're moving through centuries, region by region. Frozen villages, flooded rivers, forests so old the trees have names and reputations. We travel back to the exact moment each fear began. 9 cases. Let's open the file. Here's the pattern connecting all 9 of these creatures. Every single one started as an explanation. Not a story, an explanation. A child went missing near a river. A crop failed for no visible reason. A woman died in childbirth, and someone needed a reason why. Slavic communities didn't invent monsters for entertainment. They invented them for accountability. If the forest could kill you, the forest needed a face and a set of rules. Here's the fact that changes how you'll see this entire list. Some of these monsters were spoken about seriously within your great-grandparents' lifetime. This isn't ancient history sealed behind museum glass. This is folk memory, still warm. Some of it survived because ethnographers wrote it down in the 1800s and 1900s. They wrote it down before it could fully disappear. And the case I mentioned, the one I can't stop thinking about, it's still ahead. 9 field reports, 9 locations, 9 centuries, none of it invented for a screen. Let's start. Case file 1, Kikimora, Russia. A wooden peasant hut. 14th century, though nobody wrote the exact date down. Villagers believed a spirit lived behind every stove, in the space nobody ever swept. They called her Kikimora, small, wild-haired, sharp-nailed, and always listening. If a house stayed clean, and the family stayed kind, she stayed hidden and helpful. She'd spin thread through the night. She'd warn of danger with one dry knock. But if the house grew filthy, or the family grew cruel, she changed completely. She'd tangle every spool of wool. She'd smash the dishes in the dark. She'd stand at the foot of your bed, silent, and stare. She'd wait until you woke up screaming. Some households said you could hear her breathing behind the stove on the coldest nights. Folklorists tracing Kikimora back through Slavic mythology found something the retellings always skip. She wasn't originally a monster at all. She was a household judge, assigned to one family. Ethnographer Dmitry Zelenin cataloged Russian folk belief in the early 1900s. He recorded dozens of regional Kikimora variants, each tied to a specific moral failure. In some villages, she punished laziness. In others, she punished a cruel husband. In a few recorded accounts, she specifically punished parents who neglected a sick child. Here's the detail that sounds invented but isn't. Some households left offerings of bread specifically to keep her calm. That's the same way you'd manage a difficult relative at a family dinner. Zelenin noted Kikimora belief was strongest in households already under pressure from neighbors. That suggests the spirit did some of the community's judging for it. She wasn't feared for what she was capable of doing. She was feared for what she noticed. The scariest thing in a Slavic home wasn't a demon. It was being watched by your own house. A home could grow a monster out of neglect. Imagine what a river could grow out of grief. Case file 2, Rusalka. A river, somewhere in Ukraine. Pre-Christian Slavic belief, long before written record began. Rusalki lived in rivers and lakes, pale, beautiful, with hair that never fully dried. At night, especially around midsummer, they'd surface, singing softly across still water. Fishermen were warned never to answer that song, no matter how familiar it sounded. Farmers were warned never to swim alone after dark, especially near a river bend. A Rusalka wouldn't drag you under by force. She'd simply keep you company in the water. She'd keep you there until you stopped swimming on your own. Villagers said her laughter carried across the surface long after she had vanished beneath it. Some accounts describe her braiding grass into her hair, waiting for someone to notice her. Others describe her sitting on overhanging branches, combing her hair in complete silence. Here's where the legend gets far darker than the pretty version most retellings use. In the oldest Slavic accounts, a Rusalka wasn't a nature spirit at all. She was the ghost of one specific kind of death. Folklorist Linda Ivanits documented Russian folk belief around exactly this figure. She found Rusalki were widely believed to be the spirits of young women who drowned. Often they drowned before marriage, or while carrying a child no one would acknowledge. The river didn't create this monster. The community's silence created her, generation after generation. Here's the detail that sounds invented, but is completely documented. Villages observed a specific week, Rusalka week, when women avoided riverbanks entirely. They did it out of respect, and out of fear of becoming the next one. Some regions even timed spring planting around Rusalka week, treating her as a real authority. A Rusalka isn't a monster the river made. She's a woman the village never properly grieved. Not every water spirit was a woman scorned. The next case wore a different kind of grief. Case file #3. Striga, rural Poland. 17th century. Plague years, when explanations ran out fast. A Striga looked like an ordinary woman by day, sometimes even a respected one. At night, villagers said, something inside her changed. Her second soul woke up. She'd leave her body behind, take flight, and feed on sleeping neighbors' life force. Families who lost a child suddenly, with no wound anyone could name, suspected a Striga. Once accused, a woman could rarely defend herself. The accusation nearly always became the sentence. Some accounts describe villagers checking a suspected Striga's mouth for 2 rows of teeth. The Striga legend maps almost exactly onto a documented historical pattern. Mass, unexplained death, followed immediately by a search for someone to blame. Historian Gabor Klanitze studied witch belief across Central and Eastern Europe. He traced Striga accusations directly to plague waves and infant mortality spikes. When villages had no medical explanation, the accusation gave them one instead. It gave them a person to blame, not a disease they couldn't see. Here's the detail that sounds invented, but is grimly real. Some Striga burials involved a sickle placed across the corpse's throat. Others involved burying the body face down, specifically so she couldn't rise again. A few accounts describe stones placed directly over the mouth, for the same reason. That's not folklore flourish added for drama. That's an actual physical fear. It's buried in actual physical soil, in graveyards you could still visit today. Some of those graves are marked. Most of them are not. A Striga wasn't punished for what she did. She was punished for being the only explanation available. Some fears lived inside people. Others lived in water people had no choice but to cross. Case file #4. Drowner. A lake near a Polish village. Medieval period, deep into wetland country. The drowner, or utopiek, lived beneath still water, bloated, green-skinned, always slightly wrong-looking. Villagers said he'd been human once, always someone who died badly in water. Sometimes a suicide, sometimes a drowning nobody witnessed. He couldn't rest, so he pulled others down with him. He wanted company in the dark. He'd call out in a familiar voice, sometimes your own name, sometimes a relative's. Children were warned specifically, never answer a voice calling from the water. Never look toward it either, no matter how familiar it sounds. Some fishermen refused to work certain stretches of lake at all, regardless of the fishing. Slavic wetland regions genuinely had high accidental drowning rates. Children and livestock crossing unstable banks were especially at risk. Ethnographers studying Polish rural belief found something specific in the utopiek stories. They clustered around lakes and bogs with a documented history of drownings. Not random water at all, specifically the dangerous stretches over and over. The legend functioned as a warning label, centuries before anyone printed one. Here's the detail that sounds invented but isn't. Some communities left bread or tobacco at known dangerous crossings. They treated the drowner less like a myth, more like a toll collector. You paid him not to notice you, or your children, crossing his water. Researchers noted the offerings clustered most heavily near routes used by schoolchildren. That suggests parents were doing the actual warning, through the ritual itself. The drowner wasn't a monster guarding the water. He was a warning sign that learned to speak. We're halfway through this file. The next case is the one I mentioned at the very start. Case file #5, Leshen. Deep Slavic forest. Belief older than the Slavic language itself. The Leshen, Leshi in most regions, ruled one stretch of forest completely. He ruled nothing beyond its edge, though, no matter how powerful he seemed. He could shrink small enough to blend with bark. He could grow taller than pines. Hunters swore the forest itself would rearrange under a Leshy's will. Familiar paths simply stopped leading home, for reasons no one could explain. He wasn't cruel by nature. He was territorial, the way a landlord guards a building. Cross him, disrespect his forest, and you could walk in circles for days. You could stay feet from your own village. You'd never find the gap in the trees. Some hunters turned their coats inside out, specifically to break his hold on direction. Here's the detail almost no retelling includes. The Leshy wasn't just a forest spirit. He was a shape-shifting authority figure. Villagers negotiated with him. They swore oaths to him and struck deals over hunting rights. Ethnographer W.R.S. Ralston documented Russian folk mythology across the 1800s. He recorded hunters leaving the first kill of a hunt as tribute. That tribute kept the Leshy from redirecting their aim on future hunts. And the scale of belief in him was enormous. Bigger than almost any figure here. A single Leshy wasn't said to guard one tree or one clearing. He wasn't even said to guard just one hunting ground. He was said to govern an entire forest system, in some regional accounts. That system was described as larger than several modern countries combined. One being controlled it and never once needed to be seen to be obeyed. Picture the largest forest you've ever driven through. Now understand, in some tellings, that forest was still just the edge of his territory. You don't need a monster in every tree. Not if one entity owns the whole forest. The forest could organize around one fear. Imagine that fear reaching open fields, at noon, with nowhere to hide. Case file #6, Noonwraith. Open farmland, Poland and neighboring regions. 19th century harvest season. The Noonwraith appeared exactly at midday, in the harshest heat, walking alone through fields. She wore white, carried a sickle, and asked strange, repetitive questions of lone workers. The rule was specific and completely non-negotiable. Answer her clearly, without hesitation, or she would kill you where you stood. Farmers structured entire workdays around her, a mandatory noon break, no matter the harvest. She wasn't hiding in shadow, like most creatures in this file. She stood in the brightest part of the day, in plain, unavoidable sight. Children working the fields were pulled indoors specifically at noon, every single day. Even the strictest families made no exceptions to this rule, regardless of the deadline. The Noonwraith legend lines up almost perfectly with a real medical condition. Heat stroke strikes field workers at the exact hour she was said to appear. Folklorists studying Central European harvest customs found something telling about the noon rest. It wasn't superstition alone, it was real physiological protection, wrapped in a story. A rule works better as a warning than as advice, historically speaking. A demon with a sickle earns compliance that, stay hydrated, never will. Here's the detail that sounds invented but isn't. Several regional accounts describe her repeating a question if you answered wrong. That mirrors the disorientation real heat stroke victims describe before they collapse. Doctors studying historical harvest injuries noted the timing matches peak solar intensity. The Noonwraith didn't need to be real. The heat stroke she represented already was. Not every water spirit lived in open rivers. Some lived where the land gave up staying dry. Case file #7, Water Hag, Polish wetlands and bogs. Regional belief, still spoken about in some villages today. Villagers described a water hag, sometimes called a wodnica, as an older Rusalka cousin. She lived in swamps and marshland, not clean rivers. She was never described as beautiful. Where a Rusalka lured with a song, a water hag lured with a cry. She mimicked a lost child, or a woman in labor, calling from the reeds. Anyone who followed the sound into the bog rarely told the same story twice. She was said to drag victims down slowly, into mud, not water. That made it a much slower, much crueler kind of drowning. Older residents in some regions still warn children away from specific named bogs. Wetland regions across Slavic Europe had a real, well-documented danger. Bogs looked solid but weren't, swallowing livestock and unfamiliar travelers whole. Regional folklore collectors recorded wodnica sightings clustering around known dangerous bogs. That's the exact same pattern found with the Drowner's Lakes earlier in this file. The mimicry detail, a cry that sounds like a child, matches something real. Marsh gas and wind moving through reeds can genuinely produce voice-like sounds at night. Villagers didn't need to invent a monster from nothing. They needed to explain a sound they were already hearing, regularly, unexplained. Naturalists studying similar wetlands elsewhere have recorded comparable sounds. They describe them as unnervingly close to a human voice in distress. Some field recordings from similar marshes are still difficult to listen to at night. The water hag wasn't born from imagination. She was born from a sound nobody could explain. 2 cases remain. One belongs to the rivers that fed whole villages, not just the feared ones. Case file #8, Vodyanoy. Rivers and mill ponds across Russia. 18th and 19th century Miller folklore. The Vodyanoy ruled the water near mills specifically. Bloated, bearded, half-fish. Millers were said to negotiate with him directly, offering tobacco or the season's first fish. That kept a mill running smoothly, in exchange for staying on his good side. Angering him meant a broken wheel, or a flooded pond, or worse. Sometimes it meant a body found tangled in the mechanism the next morning. He was said to keep drowned souls as servants at the bottom of his pond. He worked them the way a landlord keeps his tenants busy. Millers, oddly, respected him more than they feared him. He was treated as a business partner, not simply a threat to survive. New millers were said to introduce themselves to him formally, like meeting a new landlord. Mill work in Slavic regions genuinely was dangerous. Mechanical drownings and equipment deaths were common enough to need explaining. Historian Faith Wigzell researched Russian folk demonology in exactly this area. She documented millers performing seasonal rituals for the Vodyanoy, year after year. They treated the spirit less like fiction, more like an insurance policy. Here's the detail that sounds invented but is well recorded. Some millers were rumored to sacrifice a black animal into the pond. They did this specifically when building a new mill on the water. That practice was serious enough to appear in period travel accounts. A dangerous machine got a personality assigned to it, complete with moods and preferences. Unlike a machine, that personality could actually be reasoned with, or bargained with. Some millers even claimed to recognize his temper by the sound the water made. Some records describe entire mill communities pooling resources for one yearly offering. They treated it as routine maintenance, not superstition at all. Millers didn't fear the Vodyanoy. They budgeted for him. One case remains. This is the one I mentioned at the very start of this file. Case file #9, Baba Yaga, Deep Russian Forest. No fixed date. She moves through every century of storytelling. Baba Yaga lived in a hut that stood on giant chicken legs. The hut spun to face whoever approached it, no matter the direction. She flew through the forest in a mortar, steering with the pestle. She swept her tracks away with a broom, trailing behind her. She was neither fully evil nor fully kind. She tested travelers. The test itself, if you failed it, could kill you outright. Ask the wrong question, show the wrong disrespect, and you became her next meal. But help the right traveler, respect the right ritual, and she rewarded you. She'd hand over exactly the wisdom, or object, that traveler needed to survive. Storytellers describe her fence as decorated with skulls that glowed faintly. They lit the path for whoever she chose to let approach. Here's the final piece of evidence, and it's the hardest to explain simply. Folklorist Andreas Johns spent years researching Baba Yaga specifically. He found she doesn't fit any single category at all. Not fully villain, not fully guide, not fully human, not fully spirit. Some scholars trace her back to ancient forest burial customs. The dead were placed in structures raised above ground, on wooden stilts. Those stilts kept scavenging animals away from the remains and resembled legs from a distance. Some archaeologists have found similar raised burial platforms across northern Slavic territory. If that theory holds, her hut isn't fantasy invented for children. It's a folk memory of an actual funeral structure. That memory transformed, over 1,000 years, into something that walks and speaks. The most unsettling case here isn't the one with the highest body count. It's the one where the monster might be a memory of real grief. It might remember how an entire culture actually treated its own dead. Some regional variants even describe 3 separate Baba Yagas, sisters, guarding different stages: arrival, trial, and release. A traveler's whole journey through grief. Baba Yaga was never designed to be defeated. She was designed to judge who deserved to pass. 9 cases, 9 fears, and now, finally, the pattern hiding underneath all of them. Every creature in this file did the same job, in a different location. A Kikimora enforced kindness inside a home. A Noonwraith enforced rest inside a body. A Leshen enforced respect for a forest. A Vodyanoy enforced caution around a dangerous machine. None of these were invented purely to entertain people sitting around a fire. They were invented to keep people alive, or accountable, to each other. There was no other authority to explain the danger they lived beside. The Witcher didn't create fear out of nothing. It borrowed fear that already had 1,000 years of practice on real people. That practice happened in real villages, long before anyone owned a controller. That's case files #9. Closed. Which of these 9 would you have actually believed, growing up, as a child? Next time, we open a file on folklore that never made it into any game. The creature's too strange, or too regional, for anyone to adapt. This is Professor Detective. Stay curious. The truth is always hiding in plain sight.